With me today, all the way from Washington, D.C., is former Wall Street investment banker turned business ethicist, Dr. Dawn Carpenter. Dr. Carpenter is a practitioner fellow at Georgetown University for the Romanovs Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor, a senior advisor, finance and humanity village for the economy of Francesco, a board advisor for the American Society for Microbiology, a consultant reviewer for the United States Department of Treasury, the former host of a top 20 iTunes business podcast, More Than Money, and the current host and executive producer of the very successful podcast called What Does It Profit? Welcome, Dawn, and thanks for joining me today.
Wow, Christy, that was quite an introduction. My mother would be proud.
You're quite a person, Dawn, so well done. Now,
well, thanks for having me. This is fun. I think I have a whopping maybe 200 listeners in Australia of my show, so I'm so glad to be coming to you and joining your listening community.
Absolutely. Now, just to give everybody a little bit of a backstory, so you reached out to me a couple of months ago and just gave me a very brief snapshot of your story. Now, I'm paraphrasing here, but a few of the things that you mentioned were that you were the daughter of felons, the first in your family to go to college, let alone get a doctorate. You told me you left a successful career in investment banking on Wall Street to become a business ethicist and host of What Does It Profit podcast. And in between all of that, you became the adoptive mother of 2 babies from Russia. Now,
yeah, that about sums it up.
I was literally blown away by just that. And I didn't really want to get into any more questions at that time because I wanted to be able to hear the story at the same time as the listeners. But what I did do is I headed straight over to your podcast and I started listening. And I am addicted. I have listened to those episodes over and over and over again. I think I could probably repeat some of them word for word. They're just amazing. The guests that you've had on, the questions that you ask are just absolutely fantastic. And I'm just hooked. So we'll get to the podcast a little bit later. But during one of those episodes, you said to one of your guests that you'll get to tell your story at another time. So Dawn, the time's come for you to tell your story. So where would you like to begin?
Oh, I was hoping that wasn't going to be your question because I was going to ask you, where would you like me to begin? In the beginning, God created the
world. Well, first tell me about your family growing up and I suppose the burning question of what did your parents do?
Oh, that's a question that's a whole show in and of itself. Well, my parents came together on a drunken whim, I would say. They met each other in a bar, which doesn't seem so weird in my family because my family owns a bar, but not at that time. So rewind to the early 70s. I'll be 50 in January, so it gives you some time perspective. But they were free-flowing, crazy people who just, hooked up one night and then here I come. And so my parents weren't married, got married for the sake of me. It lasted for a nanosecond. And then, life kind of just went weird. In the early 70s, children were typically given to the custody of the mother, but my mother had drinking and drug problems and it was just not safe for me to be there. So I was raised by my father, but my father made tires in a auto factory and worked the late night shift, and it was really not suitable for parenting. So I was raised in those early years by an aunt and uncle, which I'm very grateful for. And then when I was 5, my dad remarried, and that's when life started to get a little bit normal. So when you reference back to my little intro about myself about 2 felons. Well, the felonies happened with my mom very early on. She was quite spirited and got into trouble early in life. My dad's troubles came a little bit later, and those are with the IRS. I'm sorry. We're talking to Australians. Internal Revenue Service. These are the taxing authorities. So that kind of gets towards my interest in business ethics, but that came much, much, much later. So that's how it got started. I came from a very gregarious environment. My father and stepmother ran a pub, and They were a cash-only business, ran it really loose. And my first job was to take out the coins that were put into the pool tables when people would play pool, and I would count them, roll them up, and deposit them in the bank. And so that was, I guess you'd say, my first experience with banking. But I looked around and I saw a lot of people who had problems with drug and alcohol abuse, and I just didn't want to have anything to do with it. So if there is a teetotaler in this world, I don't know if you know that expression,
Yep.
I don't touch this stuff. And so it kind of set me on a different path. And I thought, I want to do something different with my life. And I found my way through education. And I said, this is going to be the way I escape. And so escape I did. I left my hometown, which is in the middle part of the United States, to come to Washington, D.C. And I thought at the time I was going to grow up and be a journalist, and I was going to expose the bad politicians that were doing terrible things, and I was going to follow that path. But I realized very quickly that a college education was very expensive. And what was I to know? No one in my family had ever gone to college. And my parents said, look, if you stay at one of our local schools, we'll buy you a car. I thought, well, that's a terrible trade-off. I'm going to the best university I can. And so I took off and made my way to Washington, D.C., where I did an undergraduate and graduate degree in political science, thinking that's what I would write about at American University in Washington, D.C. And so that was the beginning of it. I now have 3 graduate degrees and a doctorate. So I stayed for a lot of education, but it set me on my path. Path to what was kind of interesting. I didn't end up going the political journalism route primarily because of practical issues. I had to pay for this very expensive education, and my parents were not very supportive of all of this. And in some sense, I don't blame them because they didn't have any basis of understanding any of it. And so I said, I'm going to do this and make my way on my own. And it was really hard. I went to a private school that was very expensive. There were times during my college experience I didn't have a home. I actually lived in one of the academic buildings at the university, and I hope someone there is listening, because I always get calls for requests to donate money to the university. And I thought, well, heck, you didn't help me when I needed it. But I look back, I lived for a semester underneath the study carrels in the PhD study lounge in the upper rooms of one of the buildings on campus. Nobody knew, but I made it through. I was actually vice president of my graduating class. And I say that only because I wanted to tell the story that we were the first class to give a gift to the university when we were graduating. And we gifted a very large clock, and it sits in the middle of campus. And it says, class of 1992. And to have your name inscribed on this clock, you had to donate $19.92. Well, I was part of the campaign to put all of this together, but in those days, I didn't have $19.92. So my name doesn't appear on that clock anywhere. And so now I'm thinking, I could put my name on any one of those buildings on campus. But, that goes to show you a lot can happen in, almost 30 years.
Absolutely. So what do you think made you want to keep pursuing that? Because most people would give up. Like, that's a hard slog to be, not having a home and just wanting to pursue something that, is going to cost you a lot of money down the track, and you're going to be repaying that for a very long time. So what was it that made you pursue and continue on that really, really tough journey?
I didn't want to end up like my mother. I didn't want to not have control over my life. I didn't want to ever live in an unstable environment. I knew that it was going to be hard for a limited period of time, but then it was never going to be hard again. And that was really what drove me. It was just kind of the hope that, I could break the cycle and live a different kind of life. I mean, my mother was the first woman incarcerated in the largest women's prison in the state of Ohio. I didn't want to have that kind of legacy. And I only learned later, other horrible things. I mean, My father passed away a couple of years ago, and I've since gotten to know one of his best friends who's told me a lot of the secrets that he probably swore he would never tell. And one of those secrets, and I'm actually glad I didn't know until I was an adult, but my mother in those early days before my dad could get custody, would have me, and she'd just take off. And one of those times, here I was, a toddler walking down the street alone, abandoned. The police pick me up and they take me to the children's home. I thank goodness I have no memories of any of that. But I think somewhere deep down inside, there must be something there about all of that, because I've always felt very passionate about wanting to be an adoptive mother, and so maybe that's where it came from.
So do you think, obviously, you saw that as a way to be able to give back, to be that adoptive mother, but do you think a part of yourself didn't want to have your own children because of the experience that you went through?
I'm laughing only because I'm not exactly sure how to answer this question. I think I was married very young. I got married when I was 21 years old. I had just finished my first master's degree. I went through college very quickly, and I married the wrong person. And I think deep down inside, I didn't want to have any genetic connection to someone who now is no longer in my life. So that was probably more to do with it than what you suggest. But maybe if I spent some more time on the psychiatrist chair, maybe some of that is deep down somewhere.
So tell me about your two babies that you adopted from Russia. I know they're grown up now, but tell me about that experience of going through the adoptive process and why you chose, I suppose, to adopt children from a
Well,
country outside of the US.
yes, and a country that's not always on the friendliest terms with the US. I have two children from Russia, and they were adopted 5 years apart. So the first one came to us in the year 2000. And so it was shortly after the fall of the USSR, and things were crazy in that country, very, very difficult times. And a client of mine, I was working as an investment banker, and one of my clients was a bank. And I got to know really well the chief financial officer of that bank. And he and his wife were one of the first families anywhere in the world to adopt children from Russia, from outside of the country of Russia. And he shared with me a photo album. And in that photo album, there was one picture that still haunts me. I can close my eyes and still see it. It's a line of children lined up against the wall, each sitting on a clay pot. And the story goes that the children were not allowed to get up off the pot. And remember, these are babies who barely have the strength in their torso to sit, but they all have to sit there until there's something in everyone's pot. So could you imagine how inhumane that is? And there was something about that that just said, you know what, I'm called to do something. And, I went home after seeing that picture to my now ex-husband, and I said, I don't know how we plan on developing a family, but this is going to be part of it. And I really pushed him. And we went through an adoption agency, and it was an exhilarating, exciting, but also very heartbreaking time, because in those days, that process was highly corrupt. And I don't know if you've seen the show on Netflix called The Romanovs, but they have an episode about an American family who goes to adopt in Vladivostok, Russia. And it is very spot on to the experience that I had. You go into the country with cash strapped onto your body, with a pre-prescribed list of bribery items, everything from Estee Lauder lipstick to Starbucks coffee to, you name it. And then you're met by a stranger who takes you to a variety of different government ministries. You get the paperwork that you need, and then you meet the child. Well, this is how we met our now 21-year-old daughter. And it was awful. The whole experience was awful. I remember walking into her orphanage, and the place was silent. There were nearly 300 children under the age of 7, and the place was silent. I mean, think about it. You get a couple of kids together, and it's chaos and it's noise. But in this environment, there's no reward for, you know, crying or to making attachments, and it's just silent and it's eerie. But it is the best thing I have ever done in my entire life. She is an extraordinary child. She's had an awful lot of difficulties. She was born with a very rare birth defect that we are fairly certain was caused by pollution from the Chernobyl disaster in the Ukraine. And her mother was living in a community that had a large exposure to radiation. And she was born with basically what the neurologists describe as Swiss cheese type of texture in the base of her skull. So the base of anyone's skull is the weakest part of the bone. But in her case, there were tiny little holes. And in her case, her brain was protruding out of those holes and leaking spinal fluid. No one knew this, but when we first met her as a baby, we noticed what looked like a little tear from behind her ear. Well, it turned out it was spinal fluid coming out of surgical scars that were made because she had had terrible ear infections and needed to have tumors cut out. And it must have been excruciating for her as an infant, but it was a blessing because it was a way for us to figure out what was wrong. But it took us 3 years with some of the best neurologists in the United States to figure it out. And we went in, surgically repaired it. And so she was 3. And then fast forward to when she was 7, the leak happened on the other side. And we went in and, you know, I'm going to describe this in the only way I can describe it that makes sense to me. You know, I'm not sure how a stranger or your listeners may take this, but after that first surgery, I was frantic. You know, I've had developed such a bond with this child, and it started an intense prayer life. I never thought of myself as being very spiritually oriented. I wasn't against it, and I'm pretty sure I believed in God, but it started this kind of quest for me. And then when the doctor came back and said, yes, there's another leak on the other side, I just said to myself, I've got to find a mother to pray to. So I'm like, okay, Mother Mary, you are the highest on the pecking order. You know, you've got a pipeline to God himself. I need your help. And then I thought, well, what other mother? And I thought, well, Mother Teresa. The heck did I know? You know, she's a nun on the other side of the world, but her, you know, there was mother in her name. So I added her to the list. And here we go to do the surgery. The same surgeon who did it the last time, so he knew what he was looking for. He saw the imaging, so you could see the holes on the MRI. And he went in, and it was supposed to be about 45 minutes to an hour procedure. And it was almost 4 hours later, he comes back. And of course, I'm panicked. And he said, you know, can you sit down? And I thought, oh my gosh, she's dead. He's no, she's fine. He said, but we went in there to find and repair those holes, and they're not there. They said, we saw them on the images. We turned her upside down in the operating room to try to get a leak to come out. We didn't see it. He said, there's some things in medicine we just can't explain. And I just smiled, and I'm like, you know, I know exactly what happened. And that's what kind of started me on my own personal faith journey. And, you know, it's had all kinds of twists and turns along the way. But that little 7-year-old's, you know, suffering, you know, led me to a really great place. And so that was baby number 1. And so she was 7 at the time. And we set about in 2005 to go find her a sister. And I never imagined that I would do this again, because that first experience was just so horrible. It's this idea of, you know, the corruption. I mean, I guess you have to understand what was going on in Russia at the time. It was they were very desperate times. And but I just didn't feel right about it. But one of the analysts that during that time professionally, I had started a financial advisory firm. My investment bank was bought, and so I started a firm that represented those who needed access to capital, who needed to negotiate with the bankers. And so it was a very profitable business, and we hired staff. And one of the staff we hired was a financial analyst who was from Perm, Russia. And her name is Yana, one of my dear friends to this day. And Yana said, my mom can help. And I said, well, what are you talking about? She's like, no, my mom can help. We can do this. We'll do it without the agencies. We won't have any of the corruption that you saw from before. Things are changing in Russia. And took a leap of faith and went through an adoption process alone. And I would say now I was not alone. God was there with us, and we had a lot of good and well-meaning people along the way who helped, not least of which was my friend and analyst's mother, who sat outside the judge's office when we, at the end of the process, after we'd met our second child, would not give us a court date, which means imagine having bonded with a child only to be said, well, it's not going to happen. And I was not going to take that no for an answer. So our friend's mother sat outside the judge's office for almost 17 hours. And the judge is like, all right, here's the deal. I adopted a child to a family from Baltimore, Maryland in the United States. And the family abused the child and the child died. They said, there's no way on earth I'm going to give custody to a child to a family where there's no oversight. And, I can't blame the judge. So we hastily found another agency who would represent us at the last minute. And it turns out all these years later, that agency went out of business. And we continued to maintain contact with the court, which you have to do for 3 years after the adoption to let them know that things are going well. So we honored our side of the bargain. This little angel was born at 28 weeks. So here she was, not even 2 pounds. Yeah, it was a horrific story. So she was severely premature. And she's 16 years old now. But when she was 5 and home with us, we were on vacation, and she got I say disease, but that's not the best way to describe it. She was afflicted with something called meningoencephalitis, which, if there are any of doctors in your audience, they'll know what this is, but it's the swelling of the brain and the swelling of the outside layer of the brain or membrane around the brain that was in reaction to either a virus or bacteria. And we think it was a virus. We've not been able to identify it, but it stopped all of her bodily functions except for breathing. So we were on vacation in Florida, and it's if your listeners are familiar, it's a very beachy area. And she just felt like she had a cold or sniffles and just wasn't herself. So I took her to the emergency room, and they gave us some antibiotics and sent us back. But later that night, she started to deteriorate, and took her back to the ER. And the doctor did a scan, and that's when he saw all this swelling. And he came out into the waiting room and said, "Are you a prayerful person?" I thought, well, hell, what kind of question is that? So, do you want to hear from your doctor? And I just looked at him and said, yes. And he said, this is what I saw. Not only did he see the swelling, but he also saw that she was missing part of her brain anatomy called the corpus callosum, which is the membrane that separates the left and right hemispheres of your brain. And I've come to learn that that's very common with severely premature children, which causes some learning delays. And so when things started to deteriorate, they sent us to a regional children's hospital that was better equipped. And that's when by that time, she had lost all of her functions. And so it was, I guess it was Good Friday, which is the Friday before Easter when all of this happened. So we were transported a couple of hours away to another hospital. And I called one of my friends back home, and I said, look, you have to call our priest and get, her name is Abby on the prayer list. And she's like, yes, of course I'll do that. But where are you? And I explained where I was. And she said, you'll never guess. She said, one of our family friends is a healing priest. Like, what is a healing priest? He said, well, it's one of his charisms, and he goes all over the world helping people through the healing process. So I'm like, great, how do I get him? She said, give me your address. And it turns out he's at a parish literally right around the corner from where we are. And so it's Easter Saturday, nothing's happening. Sunday's Easter, it's no way to get in touch with him. Monday morning, I'm banging on the door and I'm like, you've got, Father Julio, you've got to come with me. And he came right over. And I'm telling you, he walked into her hospital room. And again, it was very isolating because they didn't know what kind of virus or bacteria may have caused this. So you had to go in with all of your gear and all of that. And he walks over to her, and I stand in the doorway, and I just watch. And he laid his hand maybe 2 or 3 inches above her, and he must have been praying. I couldn't hear. I was maybe 20 feet away. And he came back. It was, a couple of minutes, not very long. And he looked at me and he said, she's going to be all right. It was a long haul. I mean, we were in the hospital for another 4 months. We were able to airlift her back to our part of the country because Florida was, I don't know, about 600, 700, 800 miles away. And we got her into a rehabilitation hospital to get her in the process of being rehabilitated. So by the time she was discharged, she could walk, but she still couldn't talk. And finally, I had tried everything. I contacted a woman who did therapeutic yoga. And I thought, well, I've tried everything medicine can offer. What can you do? So she came to see her and noticed that she wasn't breathing out of her nose. She was only breathing out of her mouth. And you can't talk without breathing out of your nose. And so she did some breathing exercises with her, and she started talking again. And so she's been in special education services ever since then. But she's in high school. She's a straight A student. She wants to either be a teacher or do recreational services in a nursing home, which I thought was kind of an interesting career. But she's so happy. And, she's the conscience of the family. She kind of keeps us all on the straight and narrow. And so those are the stories of my babies. Oh, and
So
I should tell you, when the older one turned 18, I offered to take her back to Russia because neither of the children, they both are dual citizens, both American and Russian citizens. And so I offered to take her back when she became a legal adult because I didn't want to have the case where the Russians maybe wouldn't let her leave the country as a minor because she's still a Russian citizen. So I didn't want to worry about that. So she's 18 years old. I hired someone to find some of her family. So we found 2 cousins. And in Russia, they don't use the concept of cousin. They, if it's a female, they call them sisters, or if it's a male, they call them brothers. So 2 sisters, the daughters of her aunt. Her mother and father are deceased, both having died of cancer related to the radiation pollution. And most others in their family have died of liver cancer and other types of cancers. But it was wonderful. We couldn't have had a better experience. They took one look at her, knew who she was immediately because apparently she looked like her mother. And we learned that her mother and father were not married, but they had put her in the orphanage for economic reasons. They couldn't care for her. They had no idea how sick she was. And then went off. They're from a small village, maybe 3 or 4 hours south of Moscow, went to Moscow to look for work. Were gone for 2 years. We came in, adopted her, took her away. They went to the orphanage to find her. So it was actually very good to learn that because for her, it helped tie up the loose ends and to know that she was really wanted and really loved.
Yeah, that's tough. Like, at what age did you explain to them that they were adopted and that they did come from Russia and that these sort of things went on and, even the corruption behind it all? When do you decide to do that?
Well, I've kept a lot of the corruption stories. All the stories age appropriate, but the older one was really the one that has expressed the most interest in wanting to know about her birth mother. Interestingly, the kids tend to not ask much about birth fathers, but these mothers are very interesting. So when it first happened, I said, well, what would you like to know? And she said, I really want to know what she looks like. I said, look, and I took her and I put her in front of a mirror and I said, she's just a bigger version of you. And it worked. And so little by little, she would ask questions, but I was always very open about the adoption process. And I always explained it in faith terms. I said, look, I think that God has a plan for everyone. And we never know exactly what it is. We just have to follow our consciences to get there. But I believe that we were always meant to be a family. And so that's how I describe it, because I didn't want them to grow up not knowing the reality of who they are. And that was just my philosophy. Not everybody thinks that way, but it's worked out beautifully for our family. And we live just, I don't know, a mile down the street from the Russian embassy here in Washington, D.C. So there are always opportunities for cultural events. And you just go to our neighborhood grocery store, you can hear someone speaking Russian.
That's nice, though, isn't it? To be able to have that sort of connection so locally. That's awesome. Now, at the time, you were working as an investment banker. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So how did you find the time and even the desire to say, I'm going to have some children right now? How did that come about?
Well, like I said, that first kind of impetus to do anything about it came from one of my clients. And so the process got started. And in the process, I created my own firm. So my investment bank was bought. I created an advisory firm. So I had a lot of flexibility with my time. So I thought, if there's any time in my career to do this, this is probably a really good time. And as it turns out, when you're working for yourself and you have a good team behind you, you try to just make things work. But, I spent a lot of time in Russia and there's a big time difference. And so we had to be very flexible. But we made it work. I did one of the largest transactions of my entire career from Russia. We had purchased the 2 buildings in downtown Washington for the largest trade association here in the United States. And it was, $200 or $300 million transaction. And it was, at that time, it was a really, really big deal in my career, or the biggest deal I had worked on to date. And so that's, how I ended up bringing on a partner to help me with that project, who was in a closer time zone. And that partner was one of the managing directors of the bank, who is the bank I referenced, whose treasurer and chief financial officer had gone to Russia. So, it all kind of stayed connected in the family. So we worked together on this big project. And then we said, well, why don't we create this into a business? We created the firm. And then, we started working together. And then after 9/11, the terrorist attack in the United States, it became very difficult to travel. And a lot of our really lucrative clients were on the West Coast in California, and I was on the East Coast, and my partner was on the West Coast. And I would travel back and forth. And, so I spent a lot of time on airplanes. And it wasn't so difficult when our first daughter was little. I had wonderful au pairs, and, my ex-husband was, more of a, he had more of a low-key job. And so it was much easier to balance all of that. But it became difficult when, she got older, and, this dates me, but she'd say, she'd text me on the BlackBerry and say, I'll race you home from school. And what that meant was I had to get on a 777 in Los Angeles, fly to Washington, D.C., and get there before her school bus came down the road. And the way that the flight schedules worked out, it was sometimes a race. But we did it. And, it just became very difficult when it became more apparent that I was not there. And so that's when I decided to sell the firm. And so we ended up selling the firm to the bank that started all of this. And so our firm became a subsidiary of that bank, and we worked the business out that way. And then that enabled me to have an exit strategy, which put me back into a traditional bank here on the East Coast of the country, where I could have more normal hours. And then, so I did that for years, even through the sickness of the little one. And then it was, oh gosh, 2010, 2011, I got a call from a recruiter who said, we'd really like you, or maybe it's or even earlier than that. These dates are kind of all morphing together. Who said, we'd really like you to come to join us at JP Morgan. And as an investment banker, that firm is kind of the top of the game. And it was in an area that I had a particular expertise in, and I just thought, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. And so I did that for a number of years. And I have to tell you, working in a marquee bank at a very high level is very stressful. But it also made me a much better banker. When you own your own company, you can kind of structure things the way you want. You can, things are a little bit looser, but when you work for a large multinational corporation, it's a different environment. There are systems in place, there are hierarchies, procedures, protocols, things you need to contact the legal department before you do anything. You just don't have to do that when you're, a small 5-person firm. And so, it was all good, but I had a experience there that kind of set me on the trajectory that I am now. I loved working for the firm. I worked with some fantastic clients, just names that you would know. And I had an experience once in our New York City office. I had an office in Washington, D.C. and an office in New York. And I was in New York, and I had a client event the night before. And I was coming into the office, and I'm playing around on I don't remember, at that time it was an iPhone by then. And I slide into one of the elevators, and there were a series of 6 elevators in the lobby of our headquarters in New York. And it was kind of empty. I thought, well, this is weird. It's like 9 o'clock in the morning. And for me, that was really late. I would get into the office 6:30 because I like the quiet time. And so I looked over my shoulder, and there was a man in the corner. Well, it was Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan. And I thought, this is my Jamie Dimon experience, because everyone at a certain level in the firm has a Jamie Dimon story. And so, okay, this is going to be mine. How am I going to handle this, short amount of time that's going to take to get to the lobby, to the 42nd floor where I was getting off, and he was going up to 50. So I thought, well, how could I start this conversation? So I looked over at him and I said, I met a friend of yours last night, and here I am, a total stranger. And he looks at me and he's, what are you talking about? But he was a little bit more polite about it. And I said, I met Bill Clinton. And then now, years later, it does sound a little bit weird that I met Bill Clinton the night before, given the kind of things he's been accused of. But it was nothing like that. I had, it was a trade association who had invited me to an event. It was a movie screening, and it was preempted because the former president was in New York, and they had an opportunity to have him come speak to our very small group. There were maybe 50 of us. And it was the first time I'd ever heard him speak, and he's very charismatic. And he had, I think at that time, he may have had his heart surgery. So he was very trim and fit, and, it was like, wow. So I said, I met a friend of yours. Oh, who was it? Bill Clinton. And so it piques his interest. So I tell him why and the circumstances. And I talk about the film that was being screened that we missed. And I said, thanks. I really enjoy working here. We meet some really great, interesting, people. And so I left, and I go back to my desk, and I'm like, what do I do with this experience? And so I sent him an email, and I gave him a link to the film that was being screened that night. And he responded 10, 15 minutes. And I'm like, really? And then it was that moment that I had this epiphany. Like, he is just a guy, and I'm just a woman. I'm like, we're just people. And it was just that tiny little breakthrough of thought that said, what am I doing with my life? Is this all it's going to be? I've reached the top of my banking game. And at that time I was in my early 40s, or just turning 40, somewhere in that time, right? And I'm like, no, this isn't it. And so I took some soul searching, and I said, I think I want to buy a bank. And when I tell people the story, their eyes just pop out. Like, what are you talking about, buy a bank? Well, I wanted to buy a bank that was in the business of serving the underserved. Because in that epiphany, I thought, you know what? All I'm doing is I had clients whose missions were socially oriented. So I felt really good about that practice. But I was only banking the top tier organizations who, it's like making more money for people who already have money. And I'm like, is this what I'm called to do? And my answer was no. So I wanted to buy a specialty bank. We call them CDFIs here in the United States, which stands for Community Development Financial Institutions, which are special banks that commit to the Federal Treasury Department that at least 60% of their business activity will serve low income and marginalized communities. And in exchange, the Treasury Department gives special grants and supports to help keep these kinds of banks healthy. So I thought that's what I was going to do. Well, this was not very long after the 2008 financial crisis. And in our country, the regulators in the banking industry were making sure that they could shore up the health of banks. And so there was not a lot of activity for mergers and acquisitions of banks that were otherwise healthy. And I didn't want to be a banking plumber and fix this troubled bank. I wanted to go in and do the work, and so it just, the timing wasn't right. But when you're in the process of doing this, you meet accountants and lawyers and consultants who know of potential acquisition targets. But one of the advisors I was working with said, hey, there's a community development bank in Washington, D.C., where you are, who needs help with raising some capital. And he said, maybe this isn't the right time to acquire a bank, but maybe you can get in there, help solve some of their problems, and learn a little bit. And so I did, and it turned out to be a great experience, because during the financial crisis, one of the things that the federal government in the United States did was that they bought equity shares in banks. So the government became stockholders in banks to shore up those banks, which is great. Because it's a very low cost of capital, but it becomes very problematic if otherwise your bank doesn't have very good access to capital sources for repayment. Because if you don't repay, or don't repay under a certain set of terms, you can't distribute dividends to other equity holders. And so it limits your ability to raise capital. And so I went in and helped untwist all of that. And, my job was done. And I'm like, okay, what am I being called to do? At this point in my life, I've become very trusting and a very kind of faith-forward person. And, in the intervening time, I had a horrible divorce and met a wonderful man who happened to actually be on the board of directors of one of my clients. We met, we tell this story kind of jokingly. He came looking for $30 million to buy a dormitory building for a university. And I said yes on the dormitories and no on the date. And then it finally worked itself out. But then, years later, we were married, and, he said, look, you could do anything you want. What do you want to do? And I'm like, you know what? I want to know what God has to say about the nature of work and the responsibilities of wealth. I want to know about this world from a totally different perspective. No more discounted cash flows, no more, due diligence of, acquisition targets. I want to know the meaning or the why behind all of this. And so he's like, okay, go figure it out. So I thought, okay, I have 3 master's degrees by this time. I have a degree, undergraduate degree in political science, a master's in political science, a master's in public finance, and a master's in Catholic theology. And so I'm like, okay, none of those disciplines is going to get me to this answer, because I just didn't feel the answer was going to come from any one discipline. And Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. is the oldest Jesuit university in the United States, and is the first in the United States to offer an interdisciplinary doctorate. And it's called liberal studies. And it's not called liberal studies because you can study whatever you want. Well, you can in a sense, but it's the study of human values. over the continuum of time. And so you draw on different disciplines to get these kinds of answers. So we have a common set of things we study relating to primarily theology, philosophy, and history. And then we each have our own question. And my question was, what does God have to say about the nature of work and the responsibilities of wealth? And so I set about researching this. So 5 years later, what I came up with was a theory that's been floating around in 8 different academic disciplines called contributive justice theory. And it's this idea that a dimension of justice, or how we think of the concept of justice, should include this value of contribution. So out in the world, there are different ways different disciplines have thought about this. I mean, social psychologists have looked at this, anthropologists have looked at this. Let's see. I found some literature in the library sciences that have looked at this. I've seen it in psychology. I mean, there are people out there who like to understand the way we interact in the world as having either an obligation or a right to contribute. And I said, well, wait a second. If we start from a theological premise, this what does God have to say about it business, you know, we can think of us as human beings as what God and the Reverend Martin Luther King, if you're familiar with him in the United States, called our vocation of co-workers with God, meaning God is the creator, we are the creatures, and our job is to work in tandem with what we have in the material world, to make the material world, in a sense, sacred by our interaction with it. So my suggestion in my research and looking at the theology and then looking at what other disciplines have had to say is that, sure, we have an obligation to contribute to the development of ourselves, but also the development of others. The idea being that as we fully develop, we can fully realize our potential. But not only do we have that obligation to do it, but we also have the right, should have the right to do it. And you might say, well, what do you mean? Think about all those ways that society can inhibit our ability to contribute. So if we have poor health, if we don't live in a safe community, if we haven't been adequately educated, all of those things put a damper on our ability to contribute. If we've been marginalized, if we have been discriminated against, all those are, impediments or contributive injustices. And so I finished my dissertation, graduated with distinction in May virtually because of COVID, which is kind of a downer. But I was very happy that the university recognized me with what they call the Spirit of Georgetown Award, which is given to someone whose work best exemplifies the spirit of the Jesuit spirituality of Georgetown. And so for me, that was a big win because that's really what I was aiming at. So it kind of ties into why I'm doing the podcast. Because if you are if you've picked up on it, the title of the show, "What Does It Profit," goes back to a scripture reference. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world yet lose his soul? And really, what I'm after is conversation about the work that we all do. How does it contribute, or how does it benefit the common good? And so we've had all kinds of conversations. You said you listened to some. Next season, I'm so excited because it will come in tandem with a 6-part series by one of the major streaming services, which I'm not allowed to promote until they decide to promote it, of a man who was one of the most notorious narco dealers and really started the cocaine epidemic in the United States in the 70s and 80s. And he has this incredible story. It's amazing, actually, that he's still alive. But notwithstanding, he also has a tremendous story of a conversion and redemption, and has a lot of lessons to teach all of us. So he's going to kick off season 2, and we also have, just by way of stark contrast, the fellow who founded Comic-Con, which is the large conference of comic books and superheroes. And so he's going to talk about what the comic industry has to say about social justice. And so those are the, small sneak peek of, what's to come in season 2, but we've done pretty well.
It's an absolutely amazing podcast. And as I said, I've listened to all the episodes multiple times. And now I'm actually going back to listen to your previous podcast, More Than Money. So how did that one end, and what sort of tied that one up and then made you restart a new one?
Well, it all came down to a name. The problem was the show name, More Than Money. I loved it. It was very catchy. It kind of resonates with some of the same themes. But I had a man come out of the woodwork after we had 2 seasons, 24 episodes, reached as high as number 6 on iTunes Business, 6 pages deep on Google. I mean, we were all over the place. And he said, I have a trademark on the name of the show. I'm like, really? And when I went on to Apple Podcasts, there were probably 4 shows with that name. And his was, well, none of them were covering the same topics. So I didn't think there was any way to confuse the show. But he said, you talk about impact investing, and so do I. Well, this man has a show about personal finance. I'm like, we're not talking about personal finance. We're talking about 30,000 feet above all of that. And I said, if you feel really strongly, have your lawyer send my lawyer a letter. He did. And he does have a trademark on the name, but it was for an AM radio show. And so the trademark lawyer said, the law hasn't caught up. You'll probably win the case, but it's going to cost you $800 an hour, and we're going to make really interesting case law. I said, no, we're not. I said, I'm going to finish my dissertation. This is the universe's way of saying there's something else. And so that was the end of the show. But, there have been guests on that show who want to come back and be guests on the show, one of whom I'm really excited. We'll probably have him back. His name is Ralph Nader. And Ralph is the father of I call it corporate responsibility, but from a consumer's perspective. He ran for U.S. president 5 times, and is one of the leading advocates for consumer safety, and has a great story to tell. So he'll probably come back.
I did actually listen to his episode because he goes into car safety and starting off that, and then how he's been approached by so many other people to sort of help them on their journey of, I suppose, improving safety standards across so many different products and things like that. So that was a really good episode. I enjoyed him a lot, so I'm looking forward to hearing some more about him.
Oh, yeah. Well, he's good friends with my husband. My husband was very active in the civil rights era in the 1960s and was involved with Ralph when Ralph set up Citizen Action, the primary vehicle that Ralph uses for his advocacy work. But, oh, yeah, he tells a story of how private agents would follow him around Washington as he was giving testimony against the major car company and try to intimidate him. And, yeah, he's got.
Yeah, I heard him say that intimidating the witness while he's trying to give evidence into a Senate hearing. So, which is very concerning, really, isn't it?
Ooh, well, he's a brave man, and he has a museum that he set up in Connecticut, just north of New York City, about tort reform, or not, sorry, liability from corporations and torts, and I think it's called the National Museum of Torts or something like that. So if anyone in your audience is coming to New York City after COVID's a thing of the past and wants to get a little farther afield, that might be interesting. But I think it's a unique person who goes out of their way to visit that kind of museum. But it's there.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I find it, so interesting. I wanted to ask you though, Dawn, how do you sort of rationalize? You've worked on Wall Street, which is very much about creating wealth and wealth for very, very wealthy people, and then to go into CDFI and to have your own firm and to adopt children from a different country. How do you bring all those different perspectives into one to try to answer the questions that you're searching for?
Ooh, big question. I guess you'd ask the question I asked my guest: what does it profit? I don't know. I just got to a place where I thought, it's the way you view, for me, I rationalize it or think about it in such a way as to say, how do I view the reality of being a human being? Is my life here, however many years it's going to be, all there is? Or is there something else? And I've had these spiritual experiences that I can't describe, and it changed my view. I mean, you see me with eyeglasses on. I use that as an analogy. I mean, it's like putting on a set of glasses and you see the world in a wholly different way. And I guess I just have to say, go back to the name of the show. I fully believe that somewhere in some place across the continuum of time, someone's going to ask me, how did you use your life? And, I want to be able to give a good answer, or say, I gave it my best try. And it doesn't mean, I think that's my personal faith. So I happen to believe that it's going to face all of us, and we all will deal with it in whatever way we decide to deal with it. But for me, I just like to be prepared. I just want to say, I was thinking about this, and I didn't always get it right, but I recognize that, every day you wake up and get it, God willing, you get another chance. And for me, I mean, there are a lot of abuses in the financial services industry. I would say I'm blessed in a way that the section of the industry I worked in, um, I wouldn't say is blameless, because I think there are things we could do in that sector that could be better. But there are sections that are definitely worse. And so for me, I just want to be a good example. You mentioned in the introduction a project that I'm working on with the Vatican. It's a project called the Economy of Francesco. And Pope Francis made as a project an initiative to engage young business people from around the world who believe that finance should be in service to humanity. Like, well, what does that look like? And so they had an application process, brought about 2,000 people together in this quest. And of those 2,000 people, they broke them into different villages, if you will. And then they went around and looked for senior advisors. So, notwithstanding my gray hairs, I became one of the senior advisors to the village on the question of finance and humanity. And it was perfect for me, because if you look at the kinds of financial institutions I now specialize in, there's a lot of great work that these institutions do, because they're financing what we would call the real economy, not finance for finance sake, meaning manufacturing money from financial instruments. They're actually using financial instruments to perpetuate and develop economies. So they're giving people work, and giving people dignity, and expanding innovation. That's at its heart what finance does best. And so for me to be a part of that and to inspire the next generation of people who are going to come behind me is a privilege and a awesome responsibility. Every spring, I teach a cohort of finance graduate students at Catholic University here in Washington, D.C. And so I have a class coming up this spring. So I tell them, look, this is what we do in finance. And I talk about the ecosystem and all the different pieces and how we come together. And I said, but if this is a field you want to be in, you can find a place that's consistent with your values. I mean, you have to look for it, but it's there.
And do you think with the younger generation coming through that they're going to be more inclined to want to do good, as opposed to, like my son's just started his first year of university this year and in business, and he's become very disillusioned because obviously one of the first things you learn in business is, maximizing shareholder wealth, and he is just dead against that. But, I went to I did an MBA, and throughout the MBA, the underlying, I suppose, theme was, doing good, business doing good, sustainability, corporate responsibility. So we learned a lot about that. But do you think that business schools are doing enough to be able to really shift that? And do you think the younger generation coming through will do different things because they have those different values growing up?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that this generation, I may fall, a little bit before you. You might fall in between your son and me in terms of what they were teaching in business school. In my day, it was, you talk, I mean, corporate social responsibility wasn't even on the map. And so it's been, for me, it's been wonderful in my career because the first bond transaction I underwrote was for an organization that called themselves nonprofit. So you can imagine my traders who are selling 30-year bonds saying, why are we doing this for someone who right up front says they are nonprofit? I said, well, nonprofit doesn't mean that they don't make a profit. They're just not profit maximizing. And so it's a slightly different way to look at it. So fast forward all these years, the tide has changed. I'm inspired by stories about that you describe about your son who pushes back, saying, this doesn't feel right to me. I think we have a generation who are they don't come to business school and have to be taught those values. Those values come with them. And so I think the biggest challenge I see is with the professors who were not trained that way. And so some have fully embraced it. Some have realized, okay, it's here. I have to deal with it. And I think it's changing. I'm a member of the Society of Business Ethics. And so it's a bunch of business school professors from around the world who teach business ethics. And they're fully on board. This whole paradigm of stakeholder theory of management is here, and it's starting to evolve. I mean, you're starting to see now corporations who will file reports along with their standard annual reports on social responsibility. You are starting to see countries around the world have expectations of their investment advisors to be looking at, we call it ESG, environmental, social, and governance standards in the operations of companies. It's coming, and actually I'm surprised it's coming so fast. So I think that the tide has changed. I mean, it used to be that in my day, that to be an investment banker was the gold standard. That's the career you aspire to. If you aspire to business, you arrive. Nowadays, it's like, okay, if I go there for a few years, either to make a lot of money or to get some cachet on my resume or CV to go off and do something more meaningful. I'm not seeing young people so much look at it as a long-term career. And others who just say, that's the dark side. I'm not going there.
Yeah, that certainly changed the tide, because that would have been one of the most aspirational places to want to work, somewhere like JP Morgan, because I think I had a quick look at their Q3, I think it was, results for 2020, and I think it's just the amount of money was just absolutely insane.
We called it the fortress balance sheet.
Yeah, like they had reported revenues of over $30 billion, and you look at that sort of money and you go, just wow. And I think it was 1.3 trillion in liquidity sources. So it's just money that
That's
a
bigger
lot of
than
people,
economies of some countries.
absolutely, and it's things that most people just can't even wrap their heads around. So in a way, I think it's a fantastic sort of shift that people are, going there to, I suppose, learn the ropes, because you would learn absolutely so much being there. As you said, it was, a great place for you to be able to learn how to be a better investment banker. So for people to be able to go there, but then to move on to a higher purpose, I think is, really, really admirable. But I did want to ask you.
I was going to say, now I'm helping to manage the investments of the American Society of Microbiology, which are all of the scientists that are working on COVID.
And I wanted to ask you, just speaking about investments in general. So in one of your episodes, you discuss socially responsible investing, and you have somebody assess your own investment portfolio. And they found, some environmental breaches, some labor breaches, and a few other sort of revelations that I think you were probably a little bit surprised upon. So did you walk away from that episode and go, right, I'm going to look into the companies that I'm investing in? And did you make, just to get a little bit personal, but did you make any changes to the way you invest and who you're investing in based on those, I suppose, revelations that came out of that?
Oh, I'm so hypocritical. One of the firms that was one of the assets that was pointed out in the review of my portfolio was one of my favorites. It's a company called 3M. And I love them because they make, I'm looking for it on my desk, they make Post-it notes. And they make the, stuff that keeps the drafts out of your window and all this great stuff. But they've also come into a lot of problems. And what I learned in that episode, as you know, is that they've also been fairly involved in the private prison system, which I was mortified about. I had no idea. But no, I haven't divested of anything just yet. That episode only aired in October. So I figure I've got at least another quarter to kind of
to make
wrap
some
my
changes.
head around, to make some changes. But it was, if your listeners are interested, I think it's yourstake.org. You can actually put in a stock ticker symbol and you can find out a lot about the ESG components of your companies.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic initiative to be able to do that because, someone like you with your sort of standing learnt a lot from that. So, most of us regular sort of investors would be able to learn, I think, so much more.
Oh, I felt so naked though. It's like,
I was surprised. Yeah, I was like, this is putting yourself out there, having somebody publicly, look into your investments and to, they weren't really judging you, but, a bit of judgment out there of who you invest in and why you sort of do that. But I wanted to ask you as well, how much poor behaviour do you think that we should tolerate as a society as a byproduct of just doing business?
That's a tough one. I mean, you could wake up every day completely frustrated and totally depressed, and I'm not advocating that kind of lifestyle at all. But what I would say is that we each have an opportunity, just like you mentioned. I have an opportunity to do something by looking at my own portfolio. I have an opportunity to do something every time I use a plastic or glass bottle in my kitchen. Am I going to rinse it out and put it in the recycling, or am I going to be lazy and throw it in the trash? Or the companies that I patronize, are they, the good guys or the bad guys? One of my favorite episodes. Well, I think it might have been either the one you're referencing about. I think it was the one on politics. I came across something that the company Patagonia, who sells outdoor wear, said in one of the tags on their shorts that they sell. It was around the election time, and on the back of the tag it said, "Vote the assholes out." I'm sorry if I'm not allowed to say the A word, but I thought, well, that's incredible. What kind of corporation would put it out there? And so there are people who won't buy their outerwear from anywhere other than Patagonia because they are so inspired by how purposeful that company is and how they stick to the core mission, related to the sustainability of the environment. That's just a core corporate value. So I think each of us has the opportunity to look and support brands that have the same values that we possess. And it's hard. It takes a lot of effort. And sometimes it's, really painful. Again, I go back to 3M. I love them. They, spit off dividends like crazy. But, are they really espousing the values that, and here I am, I'm a small time investor, so whether I own their stock or not isn't going to make a big difference to them. But it could make a big difference to me in terms of my own ability to feel less hypocritical.
Yeah, I think that's, I was been talking to some people about work because, as I said, I've been binging your podcast, and it does make you ask some really critical questions of yourself. And somebody actually said to me the other day, but what difference, can I make as one person? But I think, it's collectively as a group, if everybody makes those small changes, we can actually create, some really big and affect some really big change in the world. Mm-hmm. Look, Dawn, I could actually talk to you for forever. Like I just have so many questions to ask you. So I think we'll definitely have to do another sort of follow-up podcast down the track, especially after season 2 comes out. And I know you ask each of your guests that quintessential question, what does it profit? But in my podcast, I ask you a little bit of a different question. So my question to you, Dawn, is what would you do differently if only you knew?
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, I think I would answer that question in relation to different facets of my life. What would I do in my personal life? I look back and I'd say I wouldn't have been so afraid. I think I made decisions early on in life because I was afraid. I mentioned about starting out life wanting to be a political journalist. I think deep in my heart, I really enjoy investigating and digging into deep questions. You do a little bit of that as a banker, but I became a banker because of necessity. I guess as a fear of never wanting to be homeless again. I'd say don't be so afraid, and just have faith. It took me a long time to find faith. And, faith is a belief in things that you can't see or things you can't prove. You just know. So I would say, that's how I'd answer that question.
Well, Dawn, you're doing such great things, just holding businesses accountable, for having purpose over profit. And the guests that you have to be able to share their stories regularly is really, really inspiring to a lot of people. So I urge everybody to check out Dawn's podcast, What Does It Profit? And if you want to know more about Dawn, you can follow What Does It Profit podcast on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. And you can also listen to Dawn's podcast everywhere that you can listen to my podcast. And I'll also have a link to all the socials and to Dawn on my website, ifonlyyouKnewpodcast.com.au. Thanks for joining me, Dawn.
Oh, thanks, Christy. I really enjoyed talking with you. You take good care of those kids.
Yeah, you too.
Be well.